Far out in the uncharted backwaters of the unfashionable end of the western spiral arm of the galaxy lies a small, unregarded yellow sun. Orbiting this at a distance of roughly 92 million miles is an utterly insignificant little blue-green planet whose ape-descendant life forms are so amazingly primitive that two of them still think doing a podcast called Digital Watches are a pretty neat idea is a pretty neat idea. These podcasters have, or rather had, a problem, which was this. Actually, this is the solution.
Hey Brian, what's this?
Well, Jeff, this is salmon.
Salmon? What kind of salmon?
Well, it's actually the Salmon of Doubt.
The Salmon of Doubt. And what would that be?
Well, it's Douglas Adams's posthumous writings, compiled by friends of his.
Wonderful. Now, if I remember, you told me that your parents gave you a signed by them, as them,
right.
Not as a forgery. First edition of the book.
That's correct. That's correct. And it's probably an American edition, obviously. They probably released it in London or England or something prior to this. But yeah, this was a book that I came home from college, I think. And after that was my birthday. My birthday's in June 22nd. And they handed me this book because they knew that I was enamored of this author. And they thought it was a great idea. So I have their signatures in the front of my hard copy book right here.
All right. So had you read it previously?
I had not read it. I think what I might have done at the time was read a little bit about maybe the jacket cover or something, and it indicated what it was, and probably thought, this is something for later reading.
So I probably have the same edition as you do.
Mm-hmm.
Mine is not signed by your parents.
Mm-hmm.
And I also had not read it until now, and I've wondered why. Like, is this one of the last things, like, when I've read this, I'm done? It's like, and if you haven't read it, then there's always that one more thing to read.
Yeah, it does kind of feel like that. And certainly it starts off that way. At this point, I think we ought to talk a little bit about our overall impressions of the book before we get into any details. Because I would imagine that you have an overall impression as I do.
Well, I want to say that this book is absolutely fantastic. And if you wondered if Douglas Adams was as brilliant as you thought or have heard people say he is, this book will confirm it.
Yes, I agree with that 100%. It certainly shows his brilliance and the high level of intelligence that he brings to his writing.
Yes.
And I have to say, though, that I kind of found the book that it went from the sublime to the absolutely ridiculous.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
There's a number of times in this book where you're going to find my response to being a lot like Forrest Gump.
Okay.
Because I'm going to say, that's all I have to say about that. Oh, gosh. I mean, I don't know, maybe it was my frame of mind, but at some points we feel assaulted by his ranting. And other times we're thoroughly entertained by the same kind of ranting. So it's interesting. And I don't know whether that's because of the reading, the listening to it, the gentleman who read it. I don't know exactly. But like I say, the message of this book goes from the sublime to the ridiculous.
Right. So again, because I have a copy of the book and I have an audio version, I did the read along because that helps me stop and make notes. But the audio version that we listened to is different than the American edition that I was reading.
Mm-hmm.
It has a couple of different introductions. The audio version has an introduction by Stephen Fry,
Mm-hmm.
and he's writing it while in Lima, Peru, searching for spectacled bears, which he called one of the least understood and most threatened mammals on the planet.
Mm-hmm.
So he's still doing this last chance to see kind of stuff back then, even though spectacled bears never made it into his program.
Yes, that I found was interesting.
Yeah, and he mostly talked about how much he misses Douglas, especially when any new technology is released. And he also explained how impossible it is to write an introduction to this book.
Right. He refers to life and how much different it is that Douglas is no longer with him. That he felt that Douglas had a clearer vision of life than most people do. And
Right.
he calls him an acute and quizzical mind.
Right. Yes, definitely.
That he was a writer at his soul.
Yes, yes. They kind of make that point, I think, a couple of times.
Oh, many times, many times. And, you know, the funny thing that I thought during this particular part of the introduction by Stephen Fry is that he says something that resonated, well, it would resonate, I think, with any of the fans of Douglas Adams, is that when you read Douglas Adams, you feel like he's talking directly to you, that you are the only person in the world that understands what he's trying to say.
Yes. I found that such a perfect way of describing how his fans feel about his works.
That's right. And he also, Stephen Fry mentions that he finds his writing and therefore the reading of his writing very addictive because you want to learn more. You want to hear more.
Yes. After that, it was followed by the eulogy that was given for Douglas Adams by Richard Dawkins. And he talked about Douglas being a scientist, and he read a few excerpts from an impromptu speech that Douglas gave at Cambridge in 1998. And not going to go into any of that there because it's included later in the book.
It is.
And he was invited as an honorary scientist. And then Dawkins wrote a lament that he read.
Mm-hmm.
And it's about waking up one morning to see the words Douglas Adams in the subject line of his list of emails without totally taking in the whole subject.
Mm-hmm.
And that is how he found out that Douglas died of a heart attack.
Right.
And he couldn't believe it, so he opened the email and found it to be true. And then he had a decision to make. Douglas Adams introduced him to his wife.
Correct.
And now it's, do I wake up my wife who's still sleeping just to tell her Douglas Adams has died?
Mm-hmm.
Or does he let her sleep in and then possibly suffer the wrath of how did you not tell me as soon as you found out?
Yes, the paradox of being a married man.
Well, that in a way reminded me of a situation we had many years ago when we had Denise's business at the other farm, and before we lived at that farm, our business address, or her horse business address, was our address in Elgin, not the barn address. So when they were looking for somebody to contact, it was us. And evidently there was a fire on one of the properties in that complex where the barn was. But we had no idea. I'm just up at midnight one night. There's a knock on the door. There's a policeman at the door. And he asks if we're involved with the inside-out horse training type of a thing. And he says, all I know is that there is a situation that involves a fire at the barn. And that's all the information he had.
Oh, geez.
And so now I have to go wake up Denise and say, honey, there's a fire at the barn. Like, how do you do that and not like just set off all kinds of panic?
Right.
But yeah, that whole having to wake somebody up to give them extremely bad news. Anyway, it was a outbuilding that was on an adjacent lot and had nothing to do with any of our business or farm or barns or horses. So it was...
That's good.
It ended up being nothing, but at the time, we didn't know.
Right, exactly. I do like the way that he defines this as a keening lament to his friend Douglas Adams. And what I did find interesting in this particular part here was that the introduction that he had to Douglas Adams was actually Dirk Gently. And he raves quite a bit about the Dirk Gently books, which we haven't touched yet.
Right.
As some of Douglas Adams's finest work. And he doesn't even reference Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy in his praise of Douglas Adams, which I thought was interesting.
Yes.
Because the two works are quite different. And I find Dirk Gently's books extremely entertaining as well.
Yes, absolutely. All right, then the audio finally gets to an introduction by Christopher Cerf that is actually in my printed copy of the book.
Mm-hmm.
He is a computer programmer who shared many of the same interests as Douglas. He introduced Douglas to the head of Infocom, which eventually published his text adventure games. The book is divided up, not surprisingly, into 3 parts: life, the universe, and everything. The editor's note by Peter Guzzardi at the beginning of this book states, "The Salmon of Doubt is Douglas's unfinished 3rd Dirk Gently novel."
Mm-hmm.
There was also supposition that he would change it to a 6th Hitchhiker's novel.
Right.
So Peter had 3 different versions written at 3 different times that he combined into a single work of a Dirk Gently novel.
Right.
So we've made the editorial decision and are only going to talk about the first 75% of this book.
Right.
The last 25% is the Salmon of Doubt edited together 3rd Dirk Gently novel. But we don't want to talk about that until we've talked about the first 2.
And isn't there an addition to that? We're going to skip over another part of the book.
Right. We've already discussed Young Zaphod Plays It Safe, which also appears in this book just before the Salmon of Doubt.
Right.
So we won't be discussing Young Zaphod Plays It Safe, but if you're interested in our feelings, you can listen to episode number 30, which is our bonus episode where all we do is talk about that piece.
Right.
So the printed book starts out with a prologue. It is basically a summary of Douglas Adams' life leading up to and the beginning of Hitchhikers. I liked one story in it. It is well known that Douglas's publishers would camp out in his house or room to force him to write. So he mostly just wrote, having no idea where the story was going. In one of his books, there was a scene with a bunch of plates that had 1 banana on each. And the publisher asked him about them. And Douglas liked to tease his readers and his publisher, so he wouldn't reveal the purpose of the plates with the banana. And then he finished the book without wrapping up the bananas. And the publisher asked him about it, and he looked at the publisher with a blank expression, having totally forgotten about them. And he never even remembered what they were for.
Yep, that's hysterical.
So it also mentions he wrote 3 computer games, Hitchhikers, Starship Titanic, and between them, in 1987, he wrote a game called Bureaucracy, and I've never heard of it.
No. Nor have I. There's another thing, well, later in the book, there's another thing that I hadn't ever heard of, and that was actually, I don't know if you're going to mention this much later, but he talks about the BBC 4 production that he did for the radio called Hitchhiker's Guide to the Future.
Yes, I've heard of it, but I've never known
tantalizing.
Yes. So you might be asking, what does this book consist of? Well, every text file from every computer Douglas had at the time of his death was curated down to this book. Some are very long, others are very short. if there is a reference to one of his works, I'm sure it moved it to the top of the list.
Right.
Regardless, it is all very fascinating. So we'll get to the first section, which is life. And the book starts out with what they call shorts. These are some of his writings that have appeared in newspapers, magazines, and who knows where else. And the fact that these still all exist in one place is amazing to me.
Mm-hmm.
So there were some notable ideas presented. As a tall boy, he hated wearing the short trouser school uniform and having to continue to wear them for a month longer than everybody else because they did not make long trousers in his size when he graduated from the class that went from short trousers to long trousers.
Right,
He's
right.
psychologically scarred.
Right, and he also mentions that instead of the teacher referring to a location, they'd all say, meet under Douglas Adams.
Yes, yeah, when he was on a field trip.
But he had the advantage of being able to see above the rest of the crowd. So
Right. They make sure to mention the book, The Blind Watchmaker by Richard Dawkins. That was a book that Douglas said changed him. Right. So now, to me, that needs to go on my must-read list, I think.
Yes, that's the second book that by Dawkins that he mentions. They also mention Richard Dawkins' book, The Selfish Gene.
Right. I think I've read that one, or at least listened to it, but The Blind Watchmaker is not one I've listened to or read. Now, when we talk about some of his pieces in here, we're not going to read them. We're not going to try to explain them. It's more going to just be a topic like this one. He does a short little piece where he compares a dog to a mistress. It's good. It's entertaining. I'm not going to try and describe it because nobody can like he does, but these are the type of random things that you're going to come across when you're reading this book.
Yes, I have to say that of all the articles, I guess this was an article that he wrote. Of all the articles in the book that they mentioned, I was least impressed with this one, oddly enough.
The dog? Oh, really?
Yeah. Oddly enough, but I'm not a dog owner, so maybe that's it.
Yeah, true.
I remember I couldn't even get the joke in the restaurant.
All right, yes, that's right.
About the dog being at fault, So
yes.
It didn't resonate in my brain. Let's just say that.
Okay.
Although at some point he's talking about the difference between Beatles fans and Stones fans. And I thought that was pretty funny. He said that the Stones fans, their knuckles are just closer to the ground,
Right. Yeah.
Oh, gosh.
I like the article he wrote about the rules of the road in other countries and how common sense will not work.
Right.
And the best part is that he was talking about his friend from Monty Python, Graham Chapman.
Mm-hmm.
And Graham Chapman used to have 2 different driver's licenses. One British and one from California. And when he was pulled over in the UK, he would show the California license. And when he was in the US, he would show the British license.
Brilliant.
And then he would say he's on his way to the airport, ready to fly back. And so...
Brilliant maneuver. The next story that's mentioned here is his introduction to Procol Harum. He is apparently at the concert with the London Symphony Orchestra.
Right.
In it, he tells the story of how he listened to the Grand Hotel by Procol Harum.
Right.
And was inspired by its sound wave, if you will, the story it was telling in its music, to create the idea of the restaurant at the end of the universe, which I thought was fascinating.
Yeah, I think he mentioned something like there was this building crescendo for no apparent reason, and he figured something big must have happened.
and that exactly, and that's when he's heard the end of the universe, I guess.
Yeah,
and that's where he came up with his concept of the restaurant at the end of the universe. After he talks about Procol Harum, he goes on to talk about New Year's resolutions. And in fact, the title of this particular article is The Hangover Cures.
Okay.
And I thought this was pretty funny. And he talks about the fact that we immediately forget the New Year's resolution because we're at a stage of drunkenness that we can only remember that New Year's resolution when we reach this stage of drunkenness. So I thought that was pretty funny. And he said the only thing that's important about the New Year is the hangover cures that need to be remembered the day after.
Right.
Then he goes on to talk about his favorite drinks. And of course, he mentions whiskey and others. And then he says, after all of the effects of those other alcohols, he's found that the one that keeps him from being too foolish is, of course, the ineffective but drinkable gin and tonic.
Yes, that's so he can drink as many of those without getting stupid.
Oh, and then he goes on to rant a little bit about the radio script intro that he's been asked to write. And he whines and complains a bit about having to write intros and then rewrite intros and then write intros to the intros.
Because it only takes 2 minutes. It only takes 2 minutes.
Yep. I thought that was kind of funny. And after that, he talks about being a writer and what authors should do, which I thought was kind of interesting because he suggests to writers that they might want to get a job working in radio. Because working in radio, the people that are listening are required to use their imagination to understand your story. And he thought that that was a good start for a writer.
Worked for him.
And I have a note somewhere in here right after that. He mentions that calendars are meaningless.
Yes. Yep.
Which I always thought was fascinating. I mean, he lays it out in a very succinct and unique way, but it is pretty funny when you think about it.
Right. He does this piece about Y2K, and it has what he calls unfinished business. Mm-hmm. And this unfinished business is that he has a problem with the Do-Re-Mi song from The Sound of Music. What I find funny, and the reason I want to mention this, is because I have always had the exact same problem with the song that he has. So just to go through it, we're not going to sing it, but the lyrics are...
Really? I would really love to hear you sing it.
No. It's doe, a deer, a female deer. Okay. Mm-hmm. Ray, a drop of golden sun. Okay, we get that. Me, a name I call myself. Yep, of course it is. So is a needle pulling thread. Mm-hmm. Yeah, of course it is. La is a note to follow so. It's like, no, you're cheating. You've got all these things, and then you get to la, and they call it a note to follow so. And it has bothered Douglas Adams, and he called it a cop-out, but he said he could never offer a suggestion as a replacement.
He comes up with his own substitute.
So Douglas called it a placeholder. It's like, he knows that Hammerstein was writing this, and he's like, I need something, so I'm just going to write a note to follow so, and I'll come back to it. And Douglas was just imagining the turmoil Oscar Hammerstein must have felt not being able to come up with anything better and having to leave that in the lyrics.
Oh, yes. Okay, I thought for sure you'd have something to say about the Dream Team in a band, which I didn't, but I made a note thinking, oh, he'll definitely talk about that.
No, I don't have Dream Team.
All right, yeah. I didn't follow all that, so I don't have anything to say about that.
Oh, all right, yeah.
But I do have a note here that I thought was funny. At some point, he's talking about inspiration.
Okay.
And he's always asked about questions about inspiration, and his best answer to that is to make sure that you have a desk that's hard enough that when you beat your head against it, it doesn't fall apart.
Right.
And I thought that was thoroughly enjoyable.
So the first real lengthy piece in here is an article he wrote called Riding the Rays.
Mm-hmm.
And he tells us the story of the way he was able to get a publisher to fly him to Australia to comparatively drive this new sub-bug immersible versus a manta ray, because he had heard that there was this place in Australia where you could ride the manta rays. Well, they quit doing that years before he went there, and he didn't realize it. So he got this publisher to fly him to do this comparative drive and was never actually able to do it.
Right. He wasn't able to ride them, but he did see them in the story, which I thought was neat. And I can't even imagine, what he was seeing, because these animals, the ones that they describe, are very large and, fascinating to be in the water with them as they ride by. So he did his comparison of riding the sub-buck with a fictional ride on a manta ray.
Right.
So during his description of the Hayman Islands and the Manta Ray Bay that he was really interested in swimming with the manta rays in, he talks about the things that happened on the island. And one of the things I thought was funny is he said one of their famous imports was tedious bureaucracy.
Right.
And he also mentions that in London, apparently there's a bridge where if you were to deface this bridge or damage this bridge in any way, the result of that would not be imprisonment, but transport to Australia for your punishment.
Right. Right.
And I think, isn't that great? I'm going to go beat on that bridge and get myself a free trip to Australia.
Yeah. So after that, he is asked who his favorite authors are. And he answered Charles Dickens, Jane Austen, Kurt Vonnegut, P.G. Wodehouse, and Ruth Rendell. And right after that is a work titled Sunset at Blandings. That also happens to be the title of P.G. Wodehouse's last and unfinished book. And then, like, a wave of sadness came over me because this book will also contain exactly that by Douglas Adams.
Yes, exactly. This was fascinating reading, but I have to tell you, the fortunate or unfortunate part of doing this particular podcast is this little chapter, which is really only 3 pages or 4 pages long in written text, could probably stir an entire podcast's worth of information out of it.
Yes.
Now, we're not going to do that. But I do want to mention that I attempted to read the recommended piece of literature that he mentions here right off the start. Okay. He talks about Wodehouse's books and how Wodehouse was 93 when he wrote this final book.
Right.
And that was one of the reasons why he wasn't able to finish it. And in talking about it, he describes a relationship of 2 people or 2 characters as having a similar relationship to a set of characters in a work by Georges Louis Borges.
Okay.
It's a short story called Pierre Menard, author of Don Quixote. And he says this is a 6-page long treatise and that you should read it and you'll thank me. And he's talking about how funny this guy is.
Right.
And how amazing this story is and how much you'll thank him for having first read this story by Borges and then, of course, the following story by Wodehouse. I attempted to read this 6-page treatise about Pierre Menard.
Okay.
And if you hadn't had an understanding of the complexity and deep level of intelligence and or I don't even know, memory, if you will, of Douglas Adams, try reading this particular 6 pages and get any humor out of it.
Okay. I did not try, but now I'm curious.
Well, the fact is, you would have to know so much about the literature that it's referencing, the people in the story that it's referencing, the characters who are supposedly part of the reason that he wrote this little story, that it would be beyond, well, certainly beyond me to understand the humor that he's talking about within this particular piece of literature. I really honestly thought I would be able to fall right into it and appreciate the humor that he talks about here. But it's humor about 16th century literature.
Wow. Sounds like a knee slapper.
Well, it's not going to fall into the puns type of humor that we all love. But there is a deep and abiding joke within this that I don't quite get. But
maybe it's Douglas's personal joke that he got people to read this. Like, oh my God, what the hell is this? And he wants to see how many people he can get to read it.
Oh my gosh. I do have to say, though, that the turn of phrase used by the author was elegant.
Okay.
But I'm not sure. I certainly didn't understand the humor that is referenced by Douglas Adams. So, but that part of this part of the book, belies the underlying intelligence of the man that we don't even get near in any of the writing that he does for us as fans.
No.
I don't think I could even mention another piece of 16th century literature if you paid me.
Right.
Oh, but that's the kind of intelligence that he had.
Yes. To kind of reference back to Last Chance to See, he talks about the rhino climb. And the rhino climb is where people climbed Mount Kilimanjaro in a rhino costume to raise money for the local people in Africa, and this was my favorite part, who are adversely affected by the efforts of conservation. So, in order to save the rhinos, they're doing all these different things, and they're trying to save rainforests and doing all this other stuff, which hurts the people who live in that area from the way they used to make a living by logging or cutting down the jungle to grow other things. And so they're raising money to support the people who are hurt by the effects of conservation. Mm-hmm. Now, this wasn't one person or a whole group of people in rhino costumes. This was one rhino costume that different people took turns wearing.
Right.
And it was hot. And it was sweaty. And the inside of that costume just must have been horrific when you were the one in it. Right. And this is the kind of environmental humor that we really enjoy from Douglas Adams that's represented in this little piece, too. Mm-hmm. The notable part of the Rhino Climb article was he pointed out that people are reluctant to donate money to a worthy cause unless you do something pointless and stupid and preferably mildly dangerous. So you can't just say these people are starving, let's help them, and people go, okay, let's help them. You say, these people are starving and we want you to donate money, so I'm going to put on a rhino costume and walk up a mountain. Oh, okay then. Here's some money. Yes, and I did like the fact that, as you've already stated, they were doing all of this in order to provide schools, education, and buildings, materials, that kind of thing, to the local tribes and local people who they were intersecting with as they were walking. Right. The next part, I don't know if you made any notes. I did not. Doesn't tend to be your kind of humor. Is a small section called For Children Only. And all I'll say to you is that it goes on to some extent about the difference between fried egg and Friday. Yeah. I got a big kick out of this because this is Adams's wordplay at its best. Mm-hmm. So the last thing in the life section is Brandenburg number 5. So we've learned earlier in the book that Douglas likes Bach, and this section just goes into depth as to why. And that's all I have to say about that.
Okay, no, I thought you'd be setting me up for something, but no,
Nope.
I don't know. And it's funny because in his description of why he likes Bach, he mentions the Mandelbrot set and the Fibonacci series.
Mm-hmm.
He just sees and this is back, if you think about it, he uses the same sort of reference to these over-encompassing concepts when he says that it has as much chance as a Welk in a supernova.
Right.
Because this is what we were talking about. The Mandelbrot set, the Fibonacci series.
Yes.
That kind of spiraling sense of the universe that exists out there.
So the middle section, the second section, is called the universe. And this section is all about technology.
Right. And here is where I've got the greater feeling of the rant than anywhere else in the book.
Oh, yeah, this is a lot of ranting.
This is a lot of ranting. So for me, there's two important things to note about this section before we get into some of the details.
Okay.
We are fortunate in that we have 22 years between the writing of these essays and the time that we currently live in. What I'd like to say to Douglas Adams in the past is just wait. Just wait.
Just wait. Yeah.
And the other thing that's important for me to note anyway, from my standpoint of finding them more rant-like, is that I'm not a Mac user. I mean, I have an Apple phone, but the only reason I have that is because my children insisted that that's what I needed.
Right.
So that I can continue to communicate with them at the level that they like to be communicated with, I have an Apple iPhone.
Right.
But this is all in the nascency of Apple computing and the Mac.
Yes.
So a lot of this is about his use of the Mac and his understanding of the computer world at that time.
Right. Exactly. So it starts off with a rant about an electrician.
Frank the Vandal.
Frank the Vandal, yes. But it's really about how complicated computing was back in 1989.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing was simple, and everything had its own wire, and everybody had a bin full of cables just in case. I still do.
Yep, me too.
But I found it a real shame of how much Douglas missed from Apple. He died a few months before the release of the iPod.
Mm.
So we didn't even get to see the iPod come into the world.
Didn't have to worry about the Zoom either.
No. So the next piece was written in 1999, and it's again about computers and their evolution from an adding machine to a typewriter to a television with a typewriter stuck in front of it to a brochure.
Mm-hmm.
When the internet came about, all the corporate websites were basically a brochure and not interactive.
Right. And that's what marketing people knew, so that's what they did.
Yeah. You couldn't get any useful information. You could only get what they wanted to tell you.
Mm-hmm.
So he was impressed that Amazon started to change everything. And again, he missed a tremendous evolution.
Oh my gosh. I don't know if I told this story on the podcast, but it's all there and it's all listening to you.
Yes, it is.
And I don't know whether it's the Alexa that sits on the desk or whether it's my iPhone and that lady that's inside of it.
Right.
But I'm sitting on the couch with my wife and she's telling me a story about how she went to the beach with one of her friends, and her friend had this neat pop-up tent thing called a cool cabana.
Mm-hmm.
And we go on over this, and I said, well, if you really liked it, then maybe you should buy one. The next day, my Facebook feed was covered with ads for the cool cabana. And so was hers.
Yes.
And we didn't look it up.
Nope.
So when they say they're not listening, you better not believe it.
Right.
Okay, everybody, put on your tinfoil hats. Here we go.
Right, yeah.
Oh my gosh. No, and that's what's funny because obviously back then, and he mentions this, Amazon was one of the first people that were grabbing the information. Nowadays, we take it as rote that everything we do is tracked and everything we know is tracked. But, back then in the 80s, I used to enjoy the internet because I would go there and say, why does a moth look like this? And it would give me an answer of some scientific paper written in the late 80s by some fancy scientist out there somewhere. Mm-hmm. Now, if I write the same thing, why does a moth look like this? It'll say, here's the local store where you can buy a moth.
Yeah, here's 3,975,221 hits on why does a moth... Like, wait...
Exactly. It doesn't give you a damn bit of information. It only tells you where you can buy something. So we are clearly back to the catalog approach or the brochure approach to the internet. Mm-hmm.
So there's an interview he did with American Atheist magazine. And what I learned from this interview is that I didn't know there was such a cultural difference in the acceptance and treatment of atheists in England as opposed to the United States.
Yeah, that was curious.
So he was asked how many times he's ever been tried to be saved in England. And his answer was an incredulous, absolutely never. Mm-hmm. But around here, walk around the corner and somebody's trying to save you.
Well, that's because, as we all know, I mean, that's how the Americas were founded, by a desire to get away from the sinful Europeans.
Right, yes.
So there are many, many large groups of quote-unquote Christians that inhabit America.
Right. And so next is the piece called The Little Computer That Could. And I understand you've got something to say about this.
Oh, not much, really, but I did find this really fascinating. Of course, he is telling us a story about how he's writing an article. Again, he's ranting about the fact that an international power supply isn't an international power supply. And he's going on and on about his MacBook and how he can't use it because he doesn't have his cord. And, he's whining about that. But he's writing this article on a Palm Top that he bought.
On a whim.
At a whim, right. At the duty-free shop. Right. And he was flying to the location where he currently is, and that's Grand Rapids, Michigan. Mm-hmm. And as you know, I used to live there.
Yes. Did you live there in 1993?
Oh, gosh. I would have to say yes. I think I did live there in 1993. So I came back here in about 2000.
Well, I didn't know if you were in Plum Grove or wherever that was in 93.
Oh, you mean West Olive?
West Olive,
yeah,
yes.
I lived in Grand Rapids. Oh, gosh. I'm not sure how many years. Maybe 8 years? 7 years?
Okay.
Yeah,
but
I think I had moved there already.
West Olive was all real close anyway.
Yes.
Yeah, your job took you in and out of Grand Rapids all the time.
Yep.
And to know he was in a hotel leaning against that wall.
Well, that's exactly right. I was trying to imagine which hotel that would be. And the only one I could think of was the one downtown, the DeVos Van Andel Hotel. Mm-hmm. So that would have been interesting.
Yeah, I think he said this is where he learned to write type with his thumbs.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And he talks about the quirky keyboard.
Right. And then right after that, he did a short blurb on noticing things that do not work and not noticing things that do. And that reminds me of what I always say when I'm having technical difficulties, which is I can live with technology and I can live without technology, but I cannot live with technology that doesn't work.
Oh boy, aren't we both suffering from that today? I mean, before we even got on here, we talked about the fact that I was frustrated by my computer and my camera isn't working right now because I don't have enough USB plugs on my new PC to make it all work.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just a pain. Just a pain.
In the piece called Turncoat, he talks about how he used to make fun of technology, and now he is its champion. And he also mentions a few things about comedy.
Mm-hmm.
Like now, everybody, everywhere, is a comedian, and it's not poignant comedy, it's drivel. And then he mentions the Pythons.
Mm-hmm.
And he said when they started, comedy was a medium in which extremely intelligent people could express things that simply could not be expressed any other way.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, yeah, kind of sums up that era of British comedy.
Yeah, is that the way you look at Benny Hill?
Oh, yeah.
Extremely intelligent people chasing a blonde around the yard.
So there's a piece titled, Is There an Artificial God? And it is a brilliant piece. It is the second lengthy piece, and he was at a scientific conference called Digital Biota 2 in Cambridge in 1998. He gave an extemporaneous speech and did not know what he was going to speak on, so he called it a debate. And it is a debate that he has with himself. There's no real way to summarize this, so to point out a few things to give you an idea of how it went, to explain the rise of intelligence and understanding, he talks about the 4 ages of sand. So,
right.
Brian, describe the 4 ages of sand.
Okay. So, in his description, he basically says that the first age of sand was glass.
Mm-hmm.
And during that first age of sand, from glass, we've got 2 of the first and second age, basically, of
right.
glass, which was the telescope,
right.
which allowed us to look out into the stars and realize
mm-hmm.
that the stars and the universe was created mostly of nothing.
Right.
And that the second age of sand or glass was the microscope,
right.
which allowed us to look closer and to infinitely smaller spaces and realize that the infinitely smaller spaces were filled with basically nothing.
Nothing. Right.
And then he goes on to say that the third age of sand is when we were able to take sand and create silicone, which is what we use to make computer chips.
Mm-hmm.
And that during that age of sand, we learned about process.
Right.
And in process, what we learned primarily from the computer chip is that the output of one process is the input of another process.
Right.
And for him, this helped to complete the circle of evolution and the creation of life on Earth. And later, I didn't get whether this was in this. Yes, it was. It was like a response, I think, to a question out in the audience where he's asked about the fourth age of sand.
Mm-hmm.
And here he talks about communication and how it starts person to person, then person to group, and that finally in the age of the internet, which is the fourth age of sand, which is actually represented by a fiber optic cable,
right.
We have what he refers to as group to group interaction and group to group communications. He also talks a little bit about the multiverse and how the multiverse helps explain many of the odd concepts of light that we just don't understand.
Right.
One of the things that I think was fascinating about this particular discussion, and remember, this was a question about whether or not an artificial God exists.
Right.
And not to be a spoiler here, but he in fact says, yes, an artificial God does exist.
Right.
But one of the things that's really a fascinating study and a thought experiment that everyone should do, in my opinion, is the story of the puddle.
Yes, the puddle is a great analogy about human beings and how many of them feel about their place in the universe. And this puddle becomes aware. It's a sentient puddle. And this puddle finds himself in this hole. And what he's amazed at is how the hole happens to exactly fit him perfectly. I mean, absolutely perfectly. Like, this hole was made specifically for him. And it's so makes you just stop and go, oh, wait, I've heard this before. Except it wasn't a puddle talking.
Mm-hmm.
And so just this whole idea of thinking that the world was made for you specifically because of the way you have fit yourself into it, it's really brilliant. And he does do a great job of explaining that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. To add on to that metaphor where he's talking about how the puddle, conforms to the space and the space conforms to the puddle, he's talking about, and why he says that an artificial God exists, is that in the universal knowledge of humanity, there are things that become known through, I guess we refer to it more like groupthink.
Mm-hmm.
It's been said that if you were to poll a large group of people, in general, any question that you ask, you're going to get the right answer. I don't know if you've ever seen any of those experiments or not, but they say that when you poll the universal brain, it tends to give you the right answer every time. And this is part of what he's talking about. He's looking for these kind of connections that since the world has existed and since people have existed on it, that there's a universal think that's out there, and not to completely dismiss it, but to recognize it as what he's referring to here as an artificial God, something that exists within the entire conglomeration of mass thinking.
Right. The next section is "And Everything." And this starts out with a nice interview with The Onion in 1998, where he gets to discuss his upcoming projects. Starship Titanic is well on its way to becoming the CD-ROM game. Ideas for the movie are moving forward after 15 years. And he has a Dirk Gently novel he walked away from because the ideas and the character did not match. He thought that the ideas would work better in the Hitchhiker series, but he's not ready to do one of those yet. And he wants to do that because, as we've mentioned before, Mostly Harmless ended in such a dark place.
Right. And it's interesting, though, we both skipped over it, and I'm not really surprised that we did, but right at the end of this last section, he does tell the cookie story. And
yes.
You and I have heard the cookie story because it's in the books and other reference material that we've read so many times. It's easy for us to just ignore the fact that it exists in this particular book.
Right.
But the cookie story starts or finishes the chapter.
Yes, I was a little bit... I kind of felt... How do I want to say this? What I found kind of funny is that when I came to something like the cookie story while reading this book for the first time, I screaming in my head, I already know this. Why is this in here? But of course, it's going to be in there. So.
Mm-hmm. Where is it in the books?
It's a story he tells Fenchurch.
Right. And Fenchurch, this is when he meets Fenchurch.
Yes.
At the train station. So what book is that?
So Long and Thanks for All the Fish. So there's a piece in here that first appeared in the Utterly, Utterly Merry Comic Relief Christmas book, 1986, called The Private Life of Genghis Khan.
Mm-hmm.
And it is based on a sketch that he and Graham Chapman wrote for the Graham Chapman show Out of the Trees back in 1975.
Right.
There were 3 things in it. First was Khan's men forcing a woman to pretend to be his nagging wife when Khan comes home after a long day of pillaging. So he doesn't have a wife, but he just needs to feel like he's got some nagging woman on him. The next was Khan's having trouble with conflicts while trying to schedule conquering the world. And the last was Khan being insulted by Wowbagger.
Right. Yeah. I felt it a bit of a stretch. It's funny. It's like one of those things where Douglas Adams has some leftover comedic chops that he needs to get out,
Yes.
Kind of felt like a leftover when I read it. That was just my personal opinion.
Right. So here's where we're going to stop and take a break.
Uh-oh.
My final thought about the book so far is that this is not a biography.
No.
However, I think it tells the reader more about who Douglas Adams was than a true biography could.
That's right.
So if you have not read it and you have it on your shelf like we have for 20-some years, pick it up and read it. You won't be disappointed.
No, you will not be disappointed. It's like I said, he goes from the sublime to the ridiculous and back again. And that's where we expect Douglas Adams to go and where we expect Douglas Adams to be. So it's definitely on par with all the other material that's out there that he's done and been involved with.
Yes, definitely.
Okay, Jeff, so what's next with this?
Well, next time, I think we should do the Douglas Adams novel about an ordinary man who has extraordinary things happen to him, who also has a girlfriend who plays the cello, and meets up with an old friend who is odd-looking, strangely dressed, and kind of a know-it-all.
Oh, we're going to start over again?
No, coincidentally, that's exactly what happens in the Dirk Gently novel. So we are going to do the Dirk Gently series, so then we can finish up this last part of Salmon of Doubt.
Right. Dirk Gently is an exciting book. I remember reading it many, many years ago. I'm looking forward to the reread of it, and I look forward to our conversation about it coming up in just 1 month.
Correct. So with all that said, Brian, this is the end. In one book, there was a scene with a bunch of plates with one bababa on each. Or bananas, I'm sorry. How did I have...
Bababa? Wait a minute. I'm lost.
Never mind. Well, you know how he makes up words?
Yes.
So I just thought that I typed what was written in the book, but my finger was off by 1. Ba-ba-ba. Like, what the hell's a ba-ba-ba? All right. Start that over. There's our outtake. Thank you for listening to this. A new episode is released on the first Thursday of every month. A special thank you goes out to Luke, Max, Greg, and Tim Lesnick for arranging and performing our opening theme. Visit our website at digitalwatchesareaprettyneatidea.buzzsprout.com. While there, you can find links to all of my Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy inspired t-shirt designs. You can contact us via email at digitalwatchespodcast@gmail.com. You can find us on YouTube and Facebook at Digital Watches Are a Pretty Neat Idea. You can message us on Twitter, or should I say X, at Watches Idea. And our Instagram is Watches Idea Podcast.
This has been a Froods for Thought production.